lease negotiations then. How do we negotiate a fair deal on both sides so that way we get what we want and the landlord gets what he wants? So I guess my main question is always like, how long should the lease be? Like, what's like an optimal, in your experience, what's like an optimal time frame for a lease for a new business? So let's say someone listening to this is thinking about starting their gym. They go and they start their gym. How long should they sign that lease for? Because I know when I did it, I was like, I'm not going to sign anything more than a year because I don't know if this is going to
Mhm.
work. So what's like a typical, in your experience, length of lease term that we should negotiate here?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really hard for me as an attorney to ever give a definitive answer, because I'll say, if you ever go to an attorney and they give you a guarantee or a definitive answer, like, walk away, because there's so many factors that come into play on these things. Like, it's really hard to be like, oh yeah, almost every lease we see, blah 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 blah. And I know that there are times that I can say that, like, okay, I'll say every lease we see has a use of premise section in it. Fine, that's an easy one to say. But when you ask me, like, what is the standard length of a commercial lease? I mean, I'll say the majority of the ones that we see are 5 years, 60 months. But I can come up with probably an equal amount of examples that vary one way or the other as I do for ones that are of 60 months. But that's probably, if somebody says they're in a multi-year lease, I assume initially it's going to be 5 years, and then they can tell me if it's wrong, if it's longer or shorter.
So Jimmy and I were in a mastermind meeting once, and we were listening to a presentation, and I forget who was even speaking. Jimmy, I don't know if you remember, but he was talking about leases, and he's basically saying that leases are worthless unless they're 10 years. You want to make sure that you have like a guarantee of 10 years. Do you remember that, Jimmy?
Oh, I do. Oh, I do. That guy, who maybe remain unnamed, presents on a lot of things and has these wild, outlandish claims that, you have to have a 10-year lease and your space has to be 3,000 square feet minimum, and you need to have like all these different models running within your business. Like, you need one-on-one and small group and boot camp, and you need to have an option to buy the building when your business gets big enough, and like all of these things that maybe just aren't realities for a gym owner starting out, but just touts this like ideal of like, these are the things you have to do, and that's the way that he speaks about it. And we're sitting there listening to it, and we're like, the average everyday trainer turned gym owner is not in a position to like make that kind of risk or take that kind of risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, when we first started, we signed a 3-year, right? And because that's what we were comfortable with, and that's what it ended up being, right? So yeah, it's kind of interesting to people have different opinions and different thought processes around business. But I mean, we're just talking about getting out of a lease. Like, you sign a 10-year lease and you're 3 years in and your business is failing. Like, why would you could potentially be liable for all 10 years of that lease if that landlord wanted to come after you in regards to it. So yeah, that was an interesting presentation on that kind of stuff. But
is there any downsides to signing shorter leases, Matt?
Again, that when you want to start talking about negotiations, like that's like point number one of negotiating is how the monthly rent, the security deposit, and the length of the lease all work together. So, if we're looking at the potential of signing a lease, and we want to try to control the cost, the monthly cost, and or the security deposit, because some landlords are going to ask for 2 months, some landlords are going to ask for 1 month. The term of the lease is an easy way to try to control that. The shorter the term of the lease, the more you can expect to pay every month. The longer the term of the lease, the less you can expect to pay every month. And so there's a fine line there between, am I comfortable? Let's go back to my example of like $3,500 a month for a lease, right? And let's say, to Jimmy's point, maybe I'm comfortable signing a 10-year lease because I can get the landlord to agree to like a $2,750 a month rent because I'm guaranteeing it for 10 years, versus if I wanted to go like a 3-year, then the landlord wants me to pay $4,000 a month. But if I go 5 years, then it's $3,500 a month, right? So there's this balancing game that the gym owner has to go through if they want to, if they need to, of how much am I comfortable paying every month versus how long am I comfortable assuming. Like, you have to look at it this way, even though we're talking about ways to get out of it, you have to go into it saying, how comfortable am I? How long am I comfortable locking myself into this? And so that's like point number one of negotiation is, do we want to pay more or pay less in order to control the length of the term, or do we want to control the length of the term in an effort to pay more or pay less?
And I guess it's the same thing when it comes to those CAM fees and other fees that we were talking about earlier. All of that stuff is negotiable, correct?
It is. The CAM fees are more difficult to negotiate because the costs are the costs. And the landlord, if the landlord wants you to sign a triple net, then you have to assume the landlord wants you to cover all of those costs. So again, we can look at it. In one way you can negotiate the CAM is, I kind of touched on this briefly, is to ask the landlord for like a history of the CAM fees, and then get a little bit of an average of let's say the percent increase of the CAM fees over, say, the last 5 or 10 years. And then you can go to the landlord and say, look, I don't want this to be variable. I'll agree to a 4% CAM fee, a 4% of whatever, as an additional CAM fee that's going to stay the same over the next 5 years. So sure, some years I may pay a little bit more, but some years I may pay a little bit less, and hopefully they just kind of all balance out.
Beautiful. Now, there's a couple things that, and Matt, I want your opinion on some of these things too, because these are things that we've learned over the years and have allowed us to improve negotiations with landlords over time. But there's other things you can ask for in terms of saving money on your lease potentially, or putting yourself in a better business position that a lot of gym owners may not know about or understand when they're negotiating. One is asking for free rent up front, right? The other is asking for step laddered rent, right? Where you don't have this bigger payment in the beginning and you make it so that the payment over the term of the lease, like say you sign a 5-year, you pay less in the beginning and more at the end to offset your costs, so you can get kind of that runway. And you can also ask for different build out parameters. Like, you can ask for a space that's a shell, right? You can ask for a space that's turned back into what you need it to be to do your own build out, or even ask for TI allowance and build out allowance and things like that. The build out allowance we can talk about a little more after we kind of talk about these other things, but we'd found that like you ask for more than what you need and you see what you get with kind of some of these things when you're starting a new lease with a new landlord and getting these things going. I don't know what you've experienced in that negotiation process or whatever. For us, it's like we ask for 6 months free rent and we might get 3, right?
Yeah. Right.
Or maybe we ask for abatement where it goes to the end, right? These kinds of things. We ask for different build out parameters, like, okay, I want this space to be a certain way before I take it over. We haven't gotten very far with those. A lot of landlords make you do all that stuff. And then when we've asked for TI or talked about TI, it ends up being a way bigger estimated cost than you contracting those providers out yourself to do the build out for you and organizing that and incurring your own expense, as opposed to the landlord incurring the expense and then giving you like an allowance. So, I don't know what you've experienced or what, your advice would be in those situations and how to negotiate that stuff, but I'd love to hear your opinion.
Yeah. And just for the listeners' sake, TI are tenant improvements. But beyond that, so this is where, an individual podcast episode on some of these legal things, like doing commercial leases and negotiating commercial leases, can be a little bit tricky, because we don't want to do a 5-hour episode trying to cover every individual situation that we could see. But we're also trying to provide gym owners with something useful. And I'll just kind of go with the caveat of like everything you just talked about can be so specific that if somebody is listening, the best thing that they can do is reach out to an attorney, whether it's us or whether it's a local person, whatever it is, like before you get a copy of that lease. You're negotiating with a landlord, but like there are just so many things that we as attorneys need to consider, that you don't come to me with the lease and be like, hey, I've got this final copy. Do you mind looking over this for me and let me know what you think? Because there may be build out, there may not be build out, and if there is build out, well, now we need to start to negotiate that stuff where, is the landlord going to pay for this? And, that goes into the discussion that Anthony and I were just having about, how do we negotiate the monthly rent? Well, build out could be a factor. If I don't have 15,000 up front for my build out, I could ask the landlord to cover that, and the landlord probably has contractors. So as you alluded to, Jimmy, it's going to be easier for that landlord now to find the person that they trust, to go in, short of giving me all the responsibility to find the contractor and make sure the contractor is insured and make sure the contractor adds the building to their insurance policy and gets all of their permits and everything else. The landlord already has it. So is it better for me to now have the landlord absorb that 15,000 and work it into my monthly rent? So these are all like, yes, we see them. Yes, we help gym owners with it. For me to talk on a real general principle about it. Asking for a few months up front, free rent. Another factor that's going to come into that is how hot is your local area? If you fought for 4 months to try to find a location, you finally found one, you probably don't want to be asking for free stuff at the same time, because there's somebody who's probably right nipping at your heels, another business owner who's going to come in and not need those couple of months free. And so the landlord's going to be more apt to lease to that person than the landlord is to lease to you. Another thing that we like to watch for in these leases that is another thing that's potentially a little bit easier to negotiate than months free is the commencement date versus the access date. Okay. And so what we'll see is, let's say I'm starting a lease March 1. Okay. So the commencement date of my lease is March 1. That commencement date is then defined as that's the first month I have to make my payment is March 1. But can I get access to the premises starting February 1? So I don't necessarily get a month free of rent, but I get a month of access. And now I can go in there and I can get all my equipment set up. I can get my pull-up rig attached to the wall. I can get my office set up. I can get my whiteboard on the wall. I can get all my plates laid out, my barbells set up, everything that I need, so that come March 1, I'm hitting the ground running. Okay, and versus getting access the same time as your commencement, which means I now have to spend a month after I've paid my $3,500 for my first month's rent. I now have to spend that month getting the space ready to actually open up the doors to customers or clients. And that can be an easier way. And we see that a lot also coming out of build out. You don't want a set commencement date if there's going to be build out, because there's always going to be a delay in build out. So we have the delay, we have the build out, and then we want to stay with the landlord at the end of build out. Then we'll get our access date for a month. Then we'll get our commencement date that will be defined later once the build out is completed. And Jimmy, I know I don't know if I specifically got a lot of your stuff, but just kind of in that realm of it's all negotiable. And there's tons of options. It just really depends on your specific situation. And we can then talk about sort of here are your 5 points of negotiation, go back to the landlord.
And that was really the point, Matt. It's like I think a lot of gym owners don't realize that they have some power in that negotiation, where a lot of them will go in and especially when I was a new gym owner, I'm glad I had a real estate agent that really like a commercial broker that really helped me understand these different aspects, as well as like reading some documentation, some books before getting into it. But it's like a lot of gym owners think, oh, I got to sign this lease, I got to pay immediately, jump right into it, and then I got to do all my build out after I'm already paying rent, and then set up all my equipment and get it all in there. And they don't know that they can save some money on build out and access date and commencement date and free rent and step ladder rent and all these different things that you can, and build out costs if you don't have the money, all these different things that you can use as levers to pull to make it an easier transition for you to actually open your own storefront and have your own business in that storefront. I think a lot of gym owners just don't realize that there's these different levers to pull, and it can be complicated, and it can be a little bit overwhelming. So having people in your corner like yourself, like commercial agents, can really help to kind of solidify some of these ideas in your mind, and having somebody that understands the legal side of the lease agreement and the negotiation that is unbiased makes a lot more sense, because your agent is trying to get the most commission too, and you have to think about those things. So they may not be fighting for you for that free rent as much as they could be, because it means more commission for them potentially. So we want to think about weighing all those opinions out and having the opinions of other people before the lease gets drawn up, to make sure that you're in the right position to be the most successful. Because as Matt's saying, I mean, we're looking at 5 years. If you're 5 years into business and you're not making it, like that's an all too common thing. So we want to have the best runway possible and the best, positive outlook in that beginning, so that you have the ability to actually get the wheels spinning and get the business to get to where you want it to go, and not starting in a hole, really.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on, bud. We know that you're a busy guy, so we want you to get back to helping other gym owners. But Matt, where can the listeners find out more about you and what you do? I know I mentioned your website before, but we want to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. So gymlawyers.com is the best place to go to get a hold of me. There's calls to action all over the website. Just remember, it's gym like gymnasium, not the name like Jimmy. And then lawyers is plural. So it's gymlawyers.com. And one last thing I'll also plug in there, just because I don't like saying, we'll talk about this, and then we don't get to it and somebody's left with their like waiting for it. But I said we would talk about the ability to negotiate personal guarantees, and I just ran out of time. There's a lot of information on the website at gymlawyers.com. There's a blog on there that I update quite frequently, and there's some articles on there about how to negotiate personal guarantees. So I realize we didn't get to it, and I'm sorry we didn't get to it. I do have to hop on with some other clients, but there's information there. If you guys get any follow-up questions about it, I'm happy to answer those questions. But primary way to get a hold of me, gymlawyers.com. My cell phone's on there, calls to action are on there, my website or my email is on there. I'm not hiding, so come find me.
Matt, thank you so much for coming on, Bo. We appreciate you.
Anytime, guys. We'll talk to you soon.